My name is Melissa Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and I'll never forget the night my husband leaned close, his voice sharp and urgent. Turn the car around now. I didn't understand, but I obeyed. That decision saved our lives. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The world outside the car was a blur of black and white. Dark pines stood like silent soldiers, their branches heavy with fresh snow. The highway was a slick ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Colorado mountains, empty except for us. Inside, the air was thick with the things we hadn't said, the insults I had swallowed down at my parents' dinner table. I was driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my mind numb. My husband, Eric, sat beside me, a quiet statue in the passenger seat. He hadn't said a word since we left. Then, he moved. It was sudden, a sharp turn of his head. His eyes weren't on me. They were locked on the rearview mirror. His whole body went rigid. I felt a prickle of alarm, a tiny crack in my wall of numb resignation. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just leaned across the center console, his face close to mine. The warmth of his breath was a stark contrast to the cold dread that was starting to seep into my veins. His eyes, when they finally met mine, were dark and serious, stripped of all warmth. They held a command I had never seen before. "Melissa," he said, his voice low but razor sharp. It cut through the hum of the engine and the fog in my brain. "Turn the car around, now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, born of pure, undiluted urgency. My mind stuttered. Turn around? Here? On an empty, icy highway in the middle of the night? Why? A dozen questions flooded my thoughts, but the look on his face silenced every one of them. For the first time in my life, I didn't argue. I didn't second guess. I simply obeyed. That single split-second decision changed everything. It saved our lives and shattered the person I used to be. Trust was never a currency my family traded in. Not for me, anyway. For as long as I can remember, my instincts were treated as a character flaw, a childish fantasy I needed to outgrow. My mother was the architect of my self-doubt. Her words were the bricks that built the prison in my mind. And her favorite word for me was weak. "You're just like your grandmother, Melissa," she'd say, her voice laced with a strange mixture of pity and disappointment. "Too soft, too sensitive. You feel too much, and it makes you weak. You'll never survive without others looking out for you." She said it so often that it became a part of me, a truth I accepted like the color of my eyes. I learned to see my own feelings not as a guide, but as a misleader. My gut feelings were just drama. My worries were just anxieties. My intuition was just plain wrong. I remember being 8 years old, standing by the tire swing in our backyard. My older sister, Clara, was trying to coax me to climb higher into the big oak tree. Clara was fearless, bold, and everything my mother admired. I, on the other hand, was hesitant. I had a sick feeling in my stomach. One of the branches didn't look right. It was thick, but there was a dark, spidery crack near the trunk that made my skin crawl. "I don't think we should climb on that one," I said, pointing. "It looks like it could break." Clara rolled her eyes, a perfect imitation of our mother. "Don't be such a baby, Melissa. It's fine." My mother, who was watching from the porch, called out, her voice sharp with impatience. "For heaven's sake, Melissa, listen to your sister. Stop being so dramatic about everything." So I ignored the knot in my stomach. I pushed down the warning voice inside my head and followed Clara up the tree. We were halfway up when the branch had pointed to, under no weight at all, gave a sickening crack and crashed to the ground. It missed us, but the message was clear. I had been right. When we scrambled down, shaken and pale, I expected my mom to acknowledge it, to say, "You are right, honey. Good job listening to your instincts." Instead, she pulled me into a rough hug and said, "See what happens when you hesitate? If you'd just climbed up faster like your sister, you would have been well past it. Your fear is what puts you in danger." The logic was so twisted, so profoundly unfair, that my 8-year-old brain couldn't even process it. She had turned my caution into a flaw and my correct intuition into the source of the problem. That was the day I truly started to believe it. My feelings were not to be trusted. My mother knew best. The world knew best. Anyone knew best but me. This pattern continued through my teenage years. Clara was the golden child. She got straight A's, was captain of the cheerleading squad, and had a confidence that seemed almost radioactive. She made decisions quickly and never looked back. I, on the other hand, was quieter. I liked to read, to think things through. I got good grades, but they weren't the effortless A's that Clara brought home. I had to work for mine, and that effort was seen as another sign of my inherent weakness. "Clara just gets it," my dad would say with a proud sigh. "Melissa has to try so hard." My choices were always the wrong ones. The friends I picked were too strange. The books I read were too morose. When I decided I wanted to be a nurse, my mother's disappointment was a palpable thing in the room. She'd say, "A nurse? All that mess and the long hours? It's not a glamorous job, Melissa. Clara is going to be a marketing executive. She'll be a leader. You'll be cleaning up after people." The implication was clear. I was choosing a life of service, which in her eyes was a life of servitude. It confirmed her narrative of me as the weak one, the follower, the helper, never the one in charge. Then I met Eric. He was the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see someone who needed to be fixed. We met in a coffee shop downtown. I was studying for a final, and he was sitting at a nearby table sketching in a notepad. He was quiet, but his presence was calm and steady. He didn't fill the air with noise. He just observed. When I accidentally knocked my stack of books over, he was the one who helped me pick them up. He smiled, a genuine, gentle smile, and asked what I was studying. For the first time when I said nursing, the person I was talking to didn't look disappointed. He just nodded and said, "That's a noble thing to do. It takes a lot of strength to care for people like that." Strength. He thought I was strong. The word felt foreign, like a language I'd never spoken. Our relationship was a quiet rebellion against everything I'd been taught about myself. He listened to me. When I had a feeling about something, he wouldn't dismiss it. He'd ask, "Why do you think that?" He valued my thought process, even when I was unsure of it myself. He made me feel seen. Of course, my family saw him as another problem. His quiet nature was interpreted as weakness, his observant personality as passivity. "He's so quiet," my mother said after meeting him for the first time. "Are you sure he can stand up for you, Melissa? You need someone strong." The irony was suffocating. They saw Eric's calm as a liability, failing to understand that his was the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself. It was a deep, steady river, not a crashing wave. My family mocked me for what they called my dependence on him. At family dinners, Clara would make jokes. "So, Eric, what big decisions did you have to make for Melissa this week?" she'd ask with a saccharine smile, and my parents would chuckle. "Did you have to help her pick out what color socks to wear?" I would force a smile while my stomach churned. They didn't get it. I didn't depend on Eric to make my decisions. I depended on him to be the one person in my life who believed I could make them myself. He was my safe harbor, the place I could go after the storm of my family's judgment. He was the one who, after a draining visit with my parents, would hold my hand in the car and say, "You handled that well. You're stronger than you think." But the years of conditioning were hard to shake. Even with Eric's support, my mother's voice was a permanent resident in my head. Every time I had to make a choice, from what to cook for dinner to whether to take a new job, her words would echo in my mind. "Are you sure? You're probably wrong. You should ask someone else. You're too weak to figure this out on your own." I lived in a state of constant, low-grade doubt, a war between the person Eric saw and the person my mother had created. It was exhausting. And I had no idea that this lifelong battle was about to be brought to a head on a dark, snow-covered highway where a split-second choice would finally force me to decide which voice I was going to believe, the one that told me I was weak, or the one who was now whispering with an urgency that terrified me, for me to turn the car around. The night had started, as it so often did, with the slow, methodical draining of my spirit. It was late December, and the air in Denver had the sharp, clean bite of impending snow. We drove to my parents' house under a sky the color of slate. Their neighborhood was one of those perfectly manicured places where all the houses looked the same, monuments to conformity and quiet judgment. Holiday lights twinkled on every roof, but they felt less like celebration and more like competition. My parents' house was always immaculate, the kind of clean that feels sterile, unwelcoming. You felt like you should take your shoes off, not out of respect, but for fear of disturbing the museum-like perfection. The air inside was warm and smelled of potpourri and whatever roast was in the oven, but it offered no comfort. It was a stifling warmth, heavy with unspoken expectations. We were there to celebrate Clara's new house. It was a massive, modern structure in a wealthy suburb, and my parents were bursting with pride. The entire evening was an ode to Clara's success. We sat at the long, polished dining table, the same table where every one of my childhood insecurities had been served up like a side dish. My mother, dressed in a crisp, cream-colored sweater set, led the charge. "We are just so proud of you, Clara," she said, raising her wine glass. "A vice president at her company and now this beautiful home. You always knew exactly what you wanted and how to get it." She turned her gaze to me, her smile tightening just a fraction. "It's a wonderful thing to be so decisive." The comparison hung in the air, as it always did. Clara, the decisive one. Me, the hesitant one. Clara, the success. Me, me. I tried to be gracious. "The house sounds amazing, Clara. I can't wait to see it." "Oh, you'll love it. It's probably a little out of your league, but it's nice." My father, who usually let my mother dock the talking, chimed in. "Your sister is a real go-getter, Melissa. She's set for life. We never have to worry about her." He took a sip of his wine, his eyes finding mine over the rim of the glass. The unspoken second half of that sentence was deafening. "But we have to worry about you." The main course was served, and the conversation drifted. I made the mistake of mentioning a difficult but rewarding week I'd had at the hospital. I had been working in the pediatric ward, and we'd had a breakthrough with a little boy who had been terrified of his treatments. He finally let me give him his medicine without crying. He even gave me a hug. I said, a small flicker of pride in my voice. "He even gave me a hug." My mother sighed, a theatrical sound of weary disappointment. She placed her fork and knife down with delicate precision. "That's nice, dear," she said, her tone making it clear it was anything but it's so small. Your sister is closing multi-million-dollar deals, and you're celebrating a hug. She shook her head slowly. "I just don't understand why you settled for that life. You were always so bright. It feels like such a disappointment." Disappointment. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. Eric reached for my hand under the table, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on my skin. He was my anchor, the only thing keeping me from drifting away on the tide of her disapproval. The final blow came with dessert. My father stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass, his face beaming. To Clara, to her new house, her brilliant career, and the daughter who has made us so incredibly proud. Everyone clinked glasses. Then, as he sat down, Clara caught my eye. She had a smirk on her face, the same one she'd worn as a child, right before saying something cruel. "You know," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's funny. I'm buying houses and making partner, and Melissa is just along for the ride. Always the passenger, never the driver." Laughter rippled around the table. My father chuckled. My mother smiled, a thin, satisfied smile. It was the family's favorite joke, my perceived passivity. And in that moment, I felt myself shrink. I was a ghost at the table, a pale imitation of the daughter they wanted. I excused myself quietly, murmuring something about the bathroom, and stood in the hallway, breathing deeply, trying to fight back the hot tears that burned behind my eyes. The drive home was a descent into a cold, heavy silence. The warmth of the car did nothing to thaw the ice that had formed my chest. I was driving, focusing on the slick road, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers pushing away the light, flaky snow. The numbness was a welcome blanket, protecting me from the sharp edges of the evening's insults. But Eric was different. He wasn't numb. He was coiled, a spring wound tight. Normally, after these dinners, he would be the one to break the silence, to say something to ground me. But tonight, he was utterly still, his focus entirely outside the car. I was so lost in replaying my mother's words, Clara's laugh, that I didn't notice it at first. Then I saw it. His eyes constantly flicking from the rearview mirror to the passenger side mirror, then back again. His posture was rigid, his hands resting on his knees, but they weren't relaxed. They were poised, ready. A small, unsettling feeling began to push through my numb haze. The silence in the car was no longer just the aftermath of a bad dinner. It had changed. It had become watchful, tense. We were on a long, dark stretch of Highway 285, heading west into the mountains. The lights of the city had fallen away behind us, and the road ahead was a lonely tunnel through the dark, snow-dusted forest. There were no other cars, no signs of life. It was just us, the falling snow, and the unsettling quiet. It was in that profound isolation that Eric finally moved, his sudden motion making me jump. He leaned toward me, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, and gave the command that changed everything. The command that I, for some reason I will never fully understand, was finally ready to hear. My husband's words hung in the air, sharp and absolute. "Turn the car around. Now. Don't ask questions." For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. The falling snow, the hum of the engine, the ache in my chest, it all paused. My entire life, I had been conditioned to respond to a command like that with one word: why? My mind was a chorus of doubt, a choir conducted by my mother's voice. "He's overreacting. This is just like you, Melissa, always making things into a drama. A U-turn on an icy highway? That's reckless. It's dangerous. What's he even talking about? There's nothing out there." The arguments were instant, automatic, a well-worn path in my brain. To question a man's sudden, illogical command was sensible. To obey blindly was weak. But then I looked at him, really looked at him. His face, usually so calm and gentle, was a mask of cold intensity. There was no drama in his eyes. There was no anger, no panic. It was something deeper, something primal. It was the absolute certainty of a predator that has spotted a threat. In that moment, he was a stranger to me, and yet I had never trusted him more. The lifetime of my mother's conditioning and the 4 years of my husband's unwavering belief in me went to war in my head. You're weak. You'll never survive without others. You're stronger than you think, Melissa. Stop being so dramatic. I trust your instincts. The battle lasted only a heartbeat. A new voice, one that felt fragile but clear, pushed its way through the noise. It was my own. He sees something I don't. For once in your life, just trust someone. Trust him. My hands acted before my mind could raise another objection. I checked the rearview mirror out of pure reflex. Nothing but darkness. I flicked on my signal, a ridiculously polite gesture on an abandoned highway. Then I turned the wheel sharply to the left. The car responded with a groan of protest. The tires slipped on a patch of ice, and for a terrifying second, the back end of the vehicle fishtailed, swinging out toward the snowy shoulder. My heart leaped into my throat. I could hear my mother's voice screaming, "I told you so!" But I didn't panic. I remembered a line from a defensive driving course I had taken years ago. Steer into the skid. I eased off the gas, my hands making small, steady corrections. The car straightened out, completing the turn. We were now facing east, back toward the city lights we had left behind. My entire body was thrumming with adrenaline. What was that? "Eric, what's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't relax. He didn't even look at me. His head was turned, his eyes scanning the road behind us, the stretch we had just been on. "It's okay," he said, his voice clipped. "Just drive. Get ready to take the next exit, the one for Pine Junction. It should be in about a mile. Drive normally. Don't speed." Drive normally? It was the most insane instruction he could have given. Nothing about this was normal. My mind was racing, trying to piece it together. Had he seen a deer? An accident ahead? No, that didn't make sense with the urgency, the command to turn now. My numbness from dinner was completely gone, burned away by a clean, sharp fear. My senses felt heightened. I was aware of everything. The soft click of the turn signal, the cold air coming from the vents, the faint scent of pine and my mother's perfume still clinging to my coat. I did as he said. I drove, keeping my eyes on the road ahead, but my attention was behind us. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Darkness, snow, empty road. The doubt began to creep back in, a cold, familiar slickness. "See? Nothing. He was wrong. You made a dangerous turn for nothing. You almost crashed for nothing. Clara was right. He's just filling your head with nonsense." I felt a flush of embarrassment. I was going to have to tell my mother about this, and she would have another story to add to the legend of dramatic Melissa. "Eric?" I started, my voice wavering between fear and frustration. "There's nothing there. What did you see?" "Just keep driving, Mel," he said, his voice softer now, but still firm. "Please, just trust me a little longer." And then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a pinpoint of light in the mirror. So far back, it could have been a star. But it wasn't a star. It grew, separating into two distinct beams. Headlights. They were a long way off, but they were there, on a road that had been completely empty just a minute ago. A coincidence, my brain supplied instantly. Another car, finally, that's all. But the car was moving fast. Faster than us. The distance was closing. I could make out its shape now. It was big, dark. An SUV, maybe? Just like dozens of others on the roads in Colorado. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My mouth was dry. The exit for Pine Junction was coming up, a green sign glowing in my headlights. "Okay, take the exit," Eric said, his voice calm. "Signal. Move over smoothly." I did as he said, my movements feeling stiff and robotic. As we angled onto the off-ramp, which curved up toward the lights of the small town, I risked one last look in the mirror. The SUV was much closer now. It hadn't slowed down. Its headlights were like two angry eyes, burning into the back of my head. The threat was no longer a vague feeling in my husband's gut. It was real. It was right behind us, and it was gaining. The exit ramp was our sanctuary. It was a bridge from the dark, lawless isolation of the highway to the safety of civilization. The gas stations, the lone motel, the diner with its glowing neon sign, they were beacons of normalcy. The town of Pine Junction was little more than a wide spot in the road, but tonight it felt like the biggest city in the world. Light meant witnesses. Light meant safety. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The SUV behind us did the same. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to follow us up the ramp. It was so close I could feel the vibration of its engine, a low, menacing hum that seemed to travel through my own car's frame. Its headlights flooded my rearview mirror, blinding me, washing out everything in a glare of brilliant, terrifying white. "Don't look back," Eric said, his voice level. "Just focus on the road, head for that gas station." He was pointing to a brightly lit 24-hour Conoco at the top of the ramp. I swerved toward it, my tires crunching on the sanded asphalt. At the last possible second, the SUV had to make its choice. Follow us into the light, or continue on its path. I heard a roar as its engine gunned. Instead of following, the SUV shot past the entrance to the exit ramp, staying on the main highway. It was a fleeting shape in my side mirror, big, black, with tinted windows that reflected the gas station's lights like obsidian. Then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the falling snow, its taillights shrinking to red pinpricks before vanishing completely. I pulled into a parking spot directly in front of the gas station's glass doors, my car illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I sat with my hands still gripping the steering wheel, my body trembling with the leftover adrenaline. My breath came in ragged gasps. I could feel my own heartbeat, a frantic panic drumming against my ribs. "Are you okay?" Eric finally asked, his voice soft. He reached over and placed his hand on my arm. His touch was warm and steady. I just nodded, unable to speak. I felt a strange combination of terror and a dizzying, light-headed relief. We were safe. Whatever that was, whatever was about to happen, it hadn't. Because of him. Because I had listened. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go inside. Get some coffee." Inside the gas station was an oasis of the mundane. The air smelled of stale coffee, cleaning supplies, and gasoline. A clerk with a bored expression barely looked up from his phone as we walked in. The fluorescent lights hummed. On a small television mounted in the corner, a weatherman was cheerfully predicting another 6 inches of snow. It was all so normal, so jarringly at odds with the terror we had just experienced. Eric bought us 2 coffees, his movements deliberate and calm, as if we had just stopped on a regular road trip. He found us a small, wobbly table in the corner next to a rack of potato chips. He handed me a cup, and I wrapped my cold, shaking hands around its warmth. I finally found my voice. "What was that, Eric? You have to tell me what that was." He took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. He began, his voice low and even. "I first saw it when we left your parents' neighborhood. A black Ford Explorer. It pulled out from a side street a few houses down right after we turned onto the main road. I didn't think much of it at first." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But it stayed with us. When I'd speed up, it would speed up. When I'd slow down, it would fall back just enough to stay out of sight. The biggest tell was its lights. A couple of times when a car would come the other way, I noticed our tailgater would dim his lights way too early. It's a classic move. They do it so the oncoming driver's eyes aren't drawn to them. They're trying to be invisible." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the information. He spoke about it with such a clinical detachment. He continued. "I was 90% sure we were being followed by the time we hit the highway. When it followed us out onto 285, away from the city, away from any exits or traffic, I was 100% sure. That road is dark, and empty. It's the perfect place to run someone off the road. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt the hot coffee slosh in my stomach, the insults at the dinner table, my mother's disappointed sighs, Clara's smug laughter. It all seemed so laughably insignificant now. My biggest worry an hour ago was my family's opinion of me. Now I was faced with the chilling reality that someone might have been trying to physically harm us. But why? I whispered. Who was it? I don't know, he said, shaking his head. It could have been random. They see a nice car leaving a wealthy neighborhood, they follow it, hope to get you alone on an empty road. Or it could have been something else. But I knew we couldn't let them choose the location of the encounter. That's why I had you turn. It was the last thing they would have expected. It forced them to react, to expose themselves. I looked at my husband, at this quiet, observant man I had married, the man my family dismissed as passive and weak. And I felt a surge of something so profound it almost took my breath away. It was more than love, more than gratitude. It was a deep, bone-shattering sense of validation. The danger was real. His instinct was right. And my choice, my one split-second choice to trust him over the course of doubt in my head, had saved us. The foundation of my world, the one my mother had so carefully constructed, had just cracked right down the middle. I stared at Eric across the wobbly plastic table, the harsh lights of the gas station stripping away any pretense. The man I was looking at was the same man I'd married, but a new layer had been revealed, one I never knew existed. How did you know all that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. About the lights, about them choosing the location? You sounded like you'd seen it before. He looked down at his coffee cup, a flicker of something, hesitation maybe, in his eyes. He'd always been a private person, but there were parts of his life, before me, that were like a locked room I'd never asked to open. Before I moved to Denver, before I started my own carpentry business, I did something else, he said slowly. For about 5 years, I worked in private security, executive protection mostly. We'd do advance work for clients, scout locations, and drive them. A big part of the job was learning counter-surveillance, how to spot a tail, how to lose one, and how to tell the difference between a random car and a real threat. I was stunned into silence. Private security? My quiet, gentle Eric, who spent his days carefully crafting furniture from reclaimed wood, had a past that sounded like it was straight out of a movie. The man my mother called unambitious had once been responsible for protecting people's lives. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked, not with accusation, but with genuine curiosity. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was another life, Mel. A stressful one. A lot of long hours, a lot of paranoia. When I left that world, I wanted to leave it for good. I wanted something quiet. Something real. I found that with you. It just never seemed relevant to bring up. He looked at me, his expression earnest. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. What I saw tonight was a professional setup. Or at least a semi-professional one. The maneuver they were likely going for is a classic roadside trap. They follow you to an isolated area, somewhere with no exits and no cell service. Then they either bump your car from behind, or they pull up alongside and force you to the shoulder. He paused, letting the words sink in. The moment you get out of the car to see what's wrong, they have you. It's over. Best case scenario, it's a carjacking and a robbery. They take your vehicle, your wallet, and leave you stranded. Worst? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. My stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. The scene played out in my mind with terrifying clarity. The bump from behind, the confusion, the door opening, the dark figures emerging from the SUV, the insults from dinner, the petty family drama, it all evaporated like smoke. This was real. This was life and death. My mother called me a disappointment, had worried I settled for a small life. But my small life was almost taken from me on a dark highway, and she would never, ever understand the sheer terror of that. The gap between her world of perceived slights and my world of actual danger felt like a canyon that could never be crossed. "We have to call the police," I said, my voice shaking. Eric had already pulled out his phone. We spent the next 20 minutes on the phone with the State Patrol dispatcher trying to explain a threat that was no longer there. It was a frustrating, surreal experience. "So, let me get this straight," the dispatcher said, his voice tinny and bored. "A black SUV followed you, but it never hit you. It didn't flash its lights or try to run you off the road?" "It was pacing us. It was a classic tale," Eric said, his own voice tight with frustration. "I have experience in this field. I know what I saw." An hour later, a state trooper finally arrived. He was a young man with a tired face, and he listened to our story with an air of professional skepticism. He took down our statement, the make and model of the SUV, our best guess at a partial plate number, but it was clear he thought we were a spooked couple who had overreacted to an aggressive driver. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, handing us a card with a report number on it. "But honestly, without contact or full plate, there's not much we can do. My advice? Get home safe and lock your doors." As he drove away, I was filled with a familiar sinking feeling, the feeling of not being believed. But for the first time, it didn't make me doubt myself. It made me angry. The trooper, the dispatcher, they were just like my family, dismissing a danger they couldn't see, discounting an experience that wasn't their own. The difference was, I didn't need their validation anymore. I had seen the look in Eric's eyes. I had felt the roar of that SUV as it sped past. I knew what was real, and the knowledge was both terrifying and strangely liberating. We drove the rest of the way home in near silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a shared space of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the bullet we had just dodged. We took the longer route, sticking to well-lit main roads, and every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror made my heart skip a beat. When we finally pulled into our own driveway, I had never been so grateful to see the familiar shape of our small, cozy house. Inside, we locked the doors, drew the curtains, and stood in the middle of our living room, the events of the night swirling around us. Old habits die hard. My first instinct, the one that had been drilled into me since childhood, was to call my mom. In a crisis, you call your family. You seek comfort. You seek reassurance. A part of me, a small, naive, hopeful part, thought that maybe, just maybe, a story this serious would finally break through her wall of criticism. Maybe she would finally sound like a mother. I sat on the couch, my phone feeling heavy in my hand, and dialed her number. Eric sat beside me, his presence a silent, supportive weight. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and oblivious. "Melissa, I was just talking to your sister about the dessert. The cheesecake was a little dry, don't you think?" My throat felt tight. "Mom," I started, my voice shaky. "Something happened on the way home." I told her everything. I started with Eric's whisper, the U-turn, the black SUV. I explained how it had chased us to the exit, how it had sped off into the darkness. I even told her about Eric's past insecurity, about his certainty that it was an attempted roadside trap. I laid it all out, my voice trembling with the residual fear, hoping for a single word of concern. What I got was a laugh. It wasn't a big laugh. It was a short, sharp, airy sound, a puff of disbelief. "Oh, Melissa," she said, and the condescension in her voice was a physical blow. "You have such an imagination. It runs away with you sometimes." "Mom, this isn't my imagination. This was real. We were terrified. We called the police." "You called the police?" Now her voice was filled with exasperation. For what? Because another car was on the highway? For heaven's sake, you'll be the talk of the town. You're always so dramatic. The word hung in the air. Dramatic. My childhood nickname, the label she slept on any feeling I had that was too big for her to handle. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, extinguishing the last flicker of hope. Hold on, Clara wants to talk to you. And a moment later, my sister's sharp voice was on the line. I cannot believe you, Clara said, without even a hello. You called the police because Eric played secret agent? Are you kidding me? Of course he would fill your head with nonsense like that. He's so quiet, he probably has to make things up to feel important. And you just eat it up. You'd believe anything. The cruelty was so casual, so effortless. They hadn't heard a word I said. They hadn't heard the fear in my voice. They had only heard what they wanted to hear. A story that confirmed their long-held narrative of me as the weak, gullible, dramatic daughter, married to a passive, unremarkable man. My terror was an inconvenience to them. My potential danger was just a funny story to tell about silly Melissa. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The hot rush of shame and anger I expected never came. Instead, I felt nothing. It was a profound and sudden emptiness. The emotional cord that had tied me to them, the one I had spent my entire life desperately trying to keep intact, had just been severed. It didn't break with a loud snap. It simply dissolved. I have to go, I said, my voice flat and calm. Is that it? Clara scoffed. You call with some crazy story and then just hang up? Yes, I said. That's it. I ended the call and set the phone down on the coffee table. The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at Eric and he was watching me with an expression of quiet, simmering anger, an anger that was entirely on my behalf. He said softly, I'm so sorry they did that to you. I just hid my head. I shook my head. It's okay, I whispered. And I was surprised to find that I meant it. It wasn't okay, what they said. It was monstrous. But I was okay, because in that moment, I was finally irrevocably free of the desperate need for their approval. They had shown me who they were in the clearest terms possible. They were not a safe harbor. They were the storm. In the days that followed, my family's mockery didn't stop. I received a string of texts from Clara, filled with laughing emojis and links to articles about common anxiety disorders. My mother left a voicemail, her voice dripping with false concern, suggesting I find a good therapist to talk about my obvious phobias. They were trying to bait me, to draw me back into the familiar cycle of argument and drama. But something in me had fundamentally shifted. I didn't reply. I didn't block them. I just observed their messages as if they were missives from a foreign country, written in a language I no longer understood. My revenge wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be a confrontation. My revenge was going to be quiet. It was going to be the act of taking myself seriously when no one else would. My revenge was building a life where their opinions were irrelevant. I started with the police report. I called the state trooper and formally requested a copy. When it arrived in the mail, I placed the official document, with its cold, bureaucratic language, in a file. It was tangible proof. It was real. Next, Eric and I sat down and wrote out every single detail we could remember about the black SUV. The shape of its grille, the type of roof rack, the 3 numbers we thought we saw on the license plate. Eric took that information and made a few calls. He still had a couple of contacts from his old life, guys who worked in private investigation. He didn't ask them to do anything illegal, just to keep an ear to the ground. A week later, one of them called back. A black Ford Explorer, matching our description and partial plate, had been involved in 2 other incidents in the past month, both roadside robberies on isolated highways just outside of Denver. They hadn't hurt anyone, but they had been aggressive. This new information sent a chill down my spine, but it was also a profound validation. We weren't crazy. The threat had been real. I added this information to my file. My next step was to take control of my own fear. I didn't want to live my life looking over my shoulder. I enrolled in a weekend-long defensive driving course held at a racetrack east of the city. For 2 days, I learned how to control a car in a skid on a wet track, how to execute emergency lane changes, and how to perform a perfect J-turn. The first time the instructor sent my car into an uncontrolled spin, my heart hammered against my ribs, the memory of that U-turn on the icy highway fresh in my mind. But by the end of the weekend, I could handle the skid with calm precision. I felt a sense of power behind the wheel I had never experienced before. I was no longer a passenger in my own life. I was the driver. The true test came about a month after the incident. My phone rang, and it was my mother. Her tone was brisk and commanding, as if our last conversation had never happened. "Melissa, I need you to do something," she said. No preamble. "Clara needs a ride to the airport on Friday morning for a business trip to Chicago. Your father and I have an appointment we can't miss. You'll need to take her. Her flight is at 7, so you'll need to be here by 5 to pick her up." It wasn't a request. It was an order. A statement of fact. This was their way of pulling me back into line, of reestablishing the old dynamic. The old Melissa would have sighed, complained internally, and then agreed. The old Melissa would have endured a silent, resentful car ride with her sister just to keep the peace. But the old Melissa was gone. I took a deep breath. My voice, when I spoke, was perfectly calm and steady. "No," I said. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. I don't think she had ever heard that word from me before, not without a long, rambling apology attached to it. What do you mean, no?" she sputtered, her voice sharp with disbelief. "It's your sister. She's counting on you." "I'm not available," I said simply. "Not available? What could you possibly be doing at 5 in the morning that's more important than family?" she demanded. And that's when I took out the key to my new life and turned it in the lock. I wasn't angry. I wasn't yelling. I was simply stating a fact. After what happened to me and Eric on the highway, I've learned it's important to be careful on the road. And I trust Eric's instincts more than your words. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. I had not only refused her command, I had used the very incident she mocked as my reason. I had thrown her disbelief back in her face, not as an argument, but as a boundary. I had declared my allegiance, my trust, my faith, my loyalty. They belonged to my husband, the man who protected me, not to the people who laughed at my fear. I heard a sharp intake of breath, then the line went dead. She had hung up on me. But it didn't matter. I had already hung up on her a long time ago. The fallout from my one-word refusal was both immediate and, for me, entirely inconsequential. Clara sent a flurry of furious texts calling me selfish, unreliable, and a terrible sister. My father left a short-clipped voicemail telling me how disappointed he was in my behavior. It was the same old script, the same tired weapons they had always used against me. But this time, their words were like stones thrown against a brick wall. They made a noise, and then they fell to the ground, leaving no mark. I read the texts and deleted them. I listened to the voicemail and felt nothing but a distant pity. They were so trapped in their little drama, so desperate to maintain control, that they couldn't see the world had changed. I had changed. My life with Eric settled into a new rhythm. It was a quieter life, free from the constant, low-grade hum of my family's judgment. The absence of their calls and texts was not a void. It was a peaceful, open space. We filled that space with simple things. We cooked dinner together. We took long walks with our dog. We sat on the couch and read in comfortable silence. The tension that had always lived in my shoulders began to dissolve. I slept better. I laughed more. I felt lighter. I often thought about that night on the highway. It had been the worst night of my life, but it had also been the most important. It was a crucible that had burned away the weak, frightened person my mother had raised me to be and forged something new in her place. I realized that my family's version of love was not about support, it was about control. Their endless criticism wasn't meant to help me, it was meant to keep me small, to keep me needing them, to keep me in my designated role as the family failure. Their approval wasn't a prize to be won, it was the bars of a cage I had desperately been trying to squeeze into. True safety, I learned, didn't come from family ties. It came from trust. It came from Eric, the one person who had never tried to change me, only to show me the strength I already possessed. He hadn't given me a voice. He had simply created a space safe enough for me to find my own. And in trusting him, I had finally learned to trust myself. My sensitivity, the thing my mother had always called my greatest weakness, was actually a strength. It was an awareness, an intuition that I had been taught my entire life to ignore. That night I listened to it, and it had saved me. A year later, winter came around again. The mountains were once again covered in a thick blanket of white. One Friday night, Eric and I decided to drive up to a little restaurant we loved in Evergreen. The route took us along a stretch of the same highway, 285. As we drove through the dark, winding roads, the snow falling softly outside, I felt a memory of that old fear prickle at the edge of my mind. I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was empty. I looked over at Eric. He was driving tonight, his hands relaxed on the wheel, his face calm in the soft glow of the dashboard lights. He must have felt me looking at him because he turned his head and gave me a small, gentle smile. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. There was no fear. There was no doubt. There was just the steady presence of the man beside me and the quiet confidence within myself. I no longer needed to justify my choices. I no longer needed to fight for my own credibility. I had chosen peace over their drama, trust over their control, and silence over their noise. I had cut the ties, not with anger or revenge, but with the quiet and powerful act of driving away, and I was never, ever turning back. Have you ever ignored someone's warning only to regret it, or trusted them and avoided disaster? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of betrayal, survival, and poetic justice.